So it's live.
Yep.
So we can go. Right. So I think. Right. So I think we're going to start. I'm not supposed to be hearing myself in this. Hello. Huh? Hello. No. Hello. Hello. Yeah, I'm seeing whether I can hear myself. This is the modern technology. All right, let me put it down a bit. Right. So I think we're ready to start. So first of all, welcome to the CEO's Roundtable. I can't move any closer. The CEO's Roundtable. As you'll see, I've got an old school piece of paper. Unfortunately, I don't have an iPad. My wife would be embarrassed that I don't have an iPad like everybody else, but I wrote this on the train on the way here. So this is going to be slightly fluid and hopefully highly interactive, which I think is exactly what we're looking to do here. We're going to have joint facilitation. Helen Mountford from the World Resources Institute, she's the VP in Climate and Economics, is going to be co-facilitating with myself. I'm Nigel Beck. I'm the head of sustainable finance and ESG advisory at Rand Merchant Bank in South Africa. And my team essentially comes up with innovation around green, climate, social related products and services in the industry. And we've done quite a few iconic deals over the last few years, including some of the first green bonds on the continent, sustainability linked loans and the like. And that's really why we're here. We've got an esteemed panel who are going to be answering all the questions. They're in the hot seat. We've got Kolisi Ngoja, who's the CEO of Exaro. We've got Fleetwood Krobler, who's the CEO of Sasol. We've got Joanna Yowich, who's the CEO of the NBI, and I think she's online. And we've got Mandy Rambos, who is the general manager of the Just Energy Transition at Eskom. Unfortunately, Andre couldn't make it, but I know Mandy's more than capable of picking up everything as we go along. One of the aspects we want to get out of today, it's not just purely focused on the climate element. We're going to try and very much bring in the just element. We want to make sure that everybody understands there's a social imperative. We want to look at the financing, what is needed, how can we work together, how can we collaborate? And I think that's one of the key aspects we want to get out is how can private sector, public sector, and civil society together work on this and achieve a specific outcome. So I think with that in mind, what I'd like to do is I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to speak for 5 to 7 minutes on their specific perspectives on the just energy transition in their specific sector. So I'm going to start off with the coal miners. Polisi, will you do the honors in giving us 5 to 10 minutes of what's your views are just energy and perhaps make it quite practical?
No, thank you very much, Nigel. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, especially with my esteemed colleagues here. For us as Exaro, primarily being a coal producing company, but also with assets in renewable, 2 wind farms. The whole issue of this dealing with climate change, also looking at it from a just point of view in this transition we're talking about, is really multifaceted. It's not one-dimensional. We're not just looking at how we decarbonize by just bringing in renewables, but we are also looking at about how we start looking at about repurposing our land use from the traditional way of how we close mines, whereby in large, after closing mines, you are left with communities which are destitute for many years after the closure, to say, how do we recycle this land to create new economies whilst we are mining, and even to those mines where we have actually closed for many years ago, and how we can resuscitate and regenerate and reinvigorate and create new economies there. So to us, it cannot be just if it does not also touch and impact on those communities, which are really going to be dependent on partly this 8.5 billion that everybody is talking about. The question they are asking is, where do they fit in this whole funding that is coming through? What are going to be their net benefits? But in doing that, we also recognize that a lot of this that we have to do, whether we're talking about bringing in the technologies that are going to be required, we also have to do it with partners. And in a very practical way, one of the things that we have done as Exxaro is to actually partner with Eskom and another coal-producing company called Seriti, where between the two of us, we supply 80% of all of Eskom's coal. And we've said to ourselves that it is going to be just the right thing for us to look at how we look at decarbonizing our assets, our coal base, and also supporting and working with Eskom in terms of how they drive their own decarbonization strategy in such a way that we can deal with the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions all at the same time. But we're also having further conversation to say it's well and good to drive this decarbonization strategy, but both of us and all the three of us are huge landowners. And how do we start now in this process of decarbonizing? We start looking at our own land jointly, because in many instances, we are actually neighbors. We are basically we're dealing with the same communities. And so how do we start thinking differently about how we come together to deal with projects that are going to have significant impact on the ground, which are going to be long lasting, which are going to have to ensure that even long after we exist, these communities continue to thrive. So our view is really about how we work with others, because we can't do this on our own. How we look at it from an industry point of view, from the Mineral Council South Africa, is how we can come up with a framework, how we can come up with a platform with which we can then collectively say and think and reimagine our land in a very invigorating way that will then really deal with the ordinary person on the ground. So that's just some of the things that we are looking and thinking about and working with some of our partners. I'm hoping that sooner than later, I'll be talking to Fleetwood about how we can actually work together in some of these areas, because they are also in mining, but also they are looking at a whole new economy around hydrogen and say, how do we create an ecosystem where South African industry can, in the process of driving these new economies, but we ensure that we industrialize locally. So those are some of the things that we also need to do in terms of how we're going to make sure that we've got a sustainable economy that's driven from within South Africa with the support of the West, but primarily industrializing our country with our own companies being at the driving force of that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I think, that's a key aspect I think we'd like to unpack a little bit later. And it's very much focusing on the collaboration aspect of, working as a collective and driving the ecosystem forward. So let's move on. Mandy, from your side, from the Eskom side, what's your view of the just energy transition and, specifically looking at kind of the social elements, bringing that into the discussion as well?
Sure, thanks, Nigel. And apologies from Andre de Ruyter. He would have loved to have been here. So I'm not Andre de Ruyter. He's just slightly taller than me. He would have loved to be here, but unfortunately he had to return home. So, we are there's a number of factors, and Khaleesi, spoke about it so eloquently in terms of why we need to address the social issues back home. But there's a number of confluence of factors that bring all of this together in terms of why a just transition for South Africa is inevitable, and in fact is the right way for us to go in order to continue to improve our economic growth and our competitiveness as a country, to get back to the glory days of, when South Africa was such a pioneer of many things. And so if you look at the confluence of factors, it's things like slow economic growth, huge youth unemployment, a high Gini coefficient, highest in the world actually. There's so many woman-headed households. There's so many social factors that we need to take care of. And you think, how do you solve all of those simultaneously? How do you deal with reducing emissions and not exacerbating social impacts? And so when you look at the just energy transition, and I often say this, it is not a panacea, but it comes pretty close, because you can actually deal with a number of those issues. So the way we look at it, and it's, and for those of you who heard me this morning, my apologies if you're hearing this again, but the way we look at it from a just energy transition strategy perspective is concentric circles. So you start off with, you have projects in the center. We need to build new capacity, electricity capacity in the country. We need to strengthen our transmission grid, our distribution grid. So we have projects on the ground. But around that, in another circle around that, you have the social impacts. How can you use those projects to then stimulate industrialization, local manufacture along that value chain? So when you look at building renewables, for example, it's not just about the renewable plant you're building, but the steel industry, the aluminum industry, the copper industry, all of the industries that you can stimulate in the country. What are the value chain impacts you can have along that line? Some of the things that Khaleesi spoke about around repowering and repurposing. Repurposing has so much opportunity also for using local communities. So where you don't need, some of those value chain impacts I spoke about, you have highly skilled labor. So if you have a steam turbine engineer, you can retrain them in terms of wind turbines, or boiler engineers, all of the highly skilled labor you can easily retrain. But how do you deal with the lower skilled labor? And some of the repurposing projects that we're looking at, working together with partners like Exaro as well, around agrivoltaics, microgrids. There's so much opportunity along those project lines to use local communities and use local farmers for agrivoltaics, for example. I explained a little bit about that this morning, and I'm happy to take questions about that a little later. And then the third circle for us is policy and frameworks and governance. So the regulatory environment is so important to support what we're talking about from a just transition perspective. So it's great that we as companies can get into partnerships and do a lot of these things together. But also there are regulatory frameworks, and I don't mean flouting any of our governance and regulatory frameworks, but we need enabling frameworks. So I think as we transition as companies, and if you have, coal mining industry, you have electricity utility, which is 88% coal, you have Sasol, which is based on fossil fuels. If you have us sitting up here talking about transition, then policy frameworks must also transition. It can't be stuck in the past and must support this sort of transition. So for us, that is why that the projects are important, ensuring that our projects have that value chain impacts along the social impacts, and then the policy support for that is absolutely important. And I would just add one more thing, which is transition of business models and financing models. Again, you can't have the same financing models that supported past industries supporting what we are talking about. So if we're talking about partnership between Eskom and Exaro to build renewables in Mpumalanga and use the vast amount of lands we have, we need specific financing vehicles for that. And financing vehicles that would look at not just government guarantees, but the kinds of returns you can get from that sort of innovation around investment. So I think those various things actually need to come together in order to support a just transition. But from an Eskom perspective, those, you heard about the announcement last week, that is exactly what we're trying to push, is how do we bring all of these things together and ensure that we have innovation in the transition as well. Thanks, Nigel. I'll stop.
Perfect. Thanks, Mandy. And I think we'll pick up on a couple of those aspects a little bit later as well. Over to yourself, Fleetwood. From a Sasol perspective, where do you see this going?
Nigel, I think we have to first acknowledge that the context within where we operate in South Africa is quite unique and huge opportunity that presents itself. So the real endowment of Southern Africa with respect to sun and wind is just a huge asset that the country has. So I don't see, the starting point is a just transition. I see if we do it right, the outcome is a just transition, because the energy we need, and this was corroborated by the study that NBI did in South Africa with respect to how can we as a country, transform and get to a net zero ambition by 2050. And the study clearly indicated that our natural endowments of sun, wind, and precious metals group is really there. It's about how do we put the pieces of the puzzle together to reach that point, because we're not endowed with oil and gas, but we are endowed with sun and wind and precious metals, on top of the fauna and flora that we're all very proud of. But the point is, we have to go wisely using those natural sources, putting it together so that we have a just transition as the outcome. Now, let me take it closer to home at Sasol. So we have announced a 30% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That has a real implication for us in the next latter part of this decade, because we have to reduce coal. As Nicolisi says, we're also mining coal. We're doing around 40 million tons of coal. If we want to achieve our 30% reduction, we're going to reduce our coal quantity by at least 10 million ton, 25%. Now that is a just transition that we need to plan for and implement by the end of this decade. So we don't have a time frame to say just transition will happen over the next 20, 30 years. We have to deal with it now. And therefore, the things we're putting in place, a just transition office, the collaboration with the likes of Eskom, Exaro, the whole thing, the notion of an energy council, which we've announced, in the past weeks, those are the building blocks that needs to take the South Africa Inc. agenda together so that we can create impact and focus on the just transition pathway. Like the Minerals Council, I think the Energy Council has got a huge role to play to help the country see a clearer pathway of the just transition, because the potential, in my view, of the outcome is much bigger than the sum of the parts we have today, because of this huge transition and opportunity that can create many more jobs, create new value pools of business in hydrogen, renewables, localization, job creation, economic stimulus, green steel, green ammonia. I can go on for minutes and hours on what it can enable. It's in our ability and our realms of, if we piece it together right, we can get a real grandiose outcome for the region. And I think it is the just transition would then be the outcome of all of that things that we piece together. So I can't differ from any other context that's been put here, but the finance is, the endowment is given. Let's tick that box. The ability to put the puzzle together is given. We've got the people, we've got the technical know-how, we've got the technologies. Tick that box. The thing that we need to do smartly is the financing of this whole transition, because as South Africa, we don't have the most competitive finance access. Yes, our local banks, Nigel, you guys are doing some of the best work in terms of a banking system that's well developed and that you're enabling the industry where you can. But still, it's not competitive against our colleagues in Saudi, for example. They've got a much better financing rate to implement these type of projects. And so for South Africa to be catalytic, it's not only these other things, it's about how do we unlock it with financing that is covering the whole gambit of grants, concessional funding, as well as the normal green financing. But in the early days, we'll have to leverage the green financing with respect to what was announced. The $8.5 billion, I think, will go a long way, but that can only be the start. We need to get more of that, and we need to give confidence to the countries that put these packages together that we've got a plan to work with these funds to deliver something that they will also be seen as tangible and maybe interesting, like, for example, green hydrogen. We offer the ability on a first right of refusal to partake in the offtake of the hydrogen if they provide us the funding or access to the funding, as well as then the revenue is coming into that in currency. And I'm talking now just as one example in an export play of green hydrogen, for example. But those are the couple of thoughts that I think is what's on top of my mind. Thanks.
Perfect, thanks. And I think, obviously the financing is something that's close to my heart, so I definitely think something we can come back and circle back to just now. But let's give Joanne a chance to speak perhaps more broadly around, the greater industry of the NBI and all your various partners. So Joanne, useful to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nigel. And apologies that I am joining online. I am going to have to leave at 1. So I think that the last week and the events that we've been holding at the South African Pavilion have been really, really instructive in terms of looking at where we have reached in relation to the just energy transition and where we still have to go. And I think that where we are at the moment is that certainly within the business community, and I think increasingly within government, there is an understanding that the just energy transition poses potentially a whole set of solutions to the challenges of our current development path and to the socioeconomic problems that are linked to our current trajectory, including the issues of poverty and inequality and unemployment. And the work that we have done, and I think that there are clearly companies that have been working on this for a very long period. So Kolisi's spoken about Exxaro, Fleetwood has spoken about Sasol, Eskom has spoken about the work that they're doing. All of that has taken years to get to the point where we are at. And in that context, about a year ago, we brought together a group of CEO champions, including all of the CEOs and organizations on this panel, to try and look at whether it is possible or not for South Africa to reach net zero by 2050. And I think that when we started the work, we didn't have a clear answer. And I think there was a fair degree of skepticism, and through quite a rigorous evidence-based process that brought together very deep levels of industry expertise, we came to the conclusion that actually the pathways do exist. And so the work that Sasol is doing, the future that Exxaro sees for itself, the decarbonization process that Eskom is embarking on, all fit into that and have led that work. But I do think that in order for the kind of promise that we're seeing, and I think the 8.5 billion is clearly an important start in that, what we are going to have to do as business and as leaders of business is two things. And I think the first is really to go out and to engage much more broadly across the private sector, across companies large and small, and go beyond a whole range of sectors. Look at and Mandy's spoken about this, look at the value chains that stand to gain from an energy transition. And then secondly, I think that our relationship as business with other players in society, in particular with labor, with civil society, with the communities, in the areas where our operations are based, are going to have to become much, much more deeper and much clearer. And I think we're going to have to, as business, contribute to building the kind of social consensus that the PCC, for example, is trying to build, in order that there is, I suppose, all of society traction in relation to the kind of a new development path for the country. And I think that business has a critical role to play in that. And business, partly because of its ability to be a first mover, because of the resources we have in the business environment, because of the technical capacity, because of our ability to mobilize action. I think that we have an obligation both to lead, but to lead in a way that brings everyone else around us. And I think that the second part of that is, I think business in South Africa has over years developed relationships and understanding of the communities within which they are based and of the needs and issues related to their workforce, and has also worked with government in very close ways. And I think that restructuring those existing partnerships and relationships to come in so that there is the all of South Africa approach to the just energy transition is something that we are going to have to do. And it seems to me, certainly from the kinds of questions that we've been getting on the panel discussions that we've been running at the COP around issues of transparency, accountability, governance, inclusion, that there's still some significant work that we're going to going to need to do. I think the second thing where business can make a really, really big impact is around the development of the human capital base that we're going to need for a just energy transition in South Africa. And there is work already that is being done, and big companies have done wonderful work in relation to looking at how we how different professions how young people can be brought into different professions, how reskilling and retraining can happen. I think in the context of the just transition, there is a recognition of the need to redeploy workers and to bring younger workers into the new value chains that we want to create. But I think that business has a very particular role to play in relation to the development of the human capital, and the development of the human capital in turn is a critical piece in ensuring that the way that we do and the way we implement this in South Africa is something that really does improve the quality of life and the future prospects, in particular of young South Africans. So I think there's a long way to go. But I think that over the last 2 or 3 years, we've come an incredibly long way. I don't think we could have ever imagined 3 years ago that we would be here having this kind of a conversation today. So thank you.
Thank you. And just before, because I think you've got to jump off. I've just got one quick question, while you're on the line, and obviously you can stay on and we can ask you more. The question I had is you mentioned the younger workers. How do we crowd the younger workers into the economy? Are there any discussions that are being had with universities in South Africa or technical colleges or whatever it might be to change the syllabus or the courses essentially more aligned to what the future economy might look like? I've seen internationally that a number of universities are obviously moving in that direction. Is that something that we are going to do, we are already looking at, or are those discussions being had?
Yeah, the discussions are being had. I think that certainly Sasol has done a whole lot of this work across different companies and industries. There has been work done in my own organization. We do a lot of work around economic inclusion and youth employability. And we've worked over the last probably 7 years with a number of the technical, vocational education and training colleges to help them to relook their curriculum. So for example, in the Northern Cape, in Uppington and Kimberley, where the solar industry in South Africa has got off the ground, looked at, we retooled the plumbing and engineering curricula in the technical colleges in those two towns in order that young people could go into the solar industry. So there's some of that work happening. There is more and more of it being done. And I think an increasing willingness on the part of the colleges themselves to work with and to collaborate with business in order that the curricula that they run are industry relevant. And when they're industry relevant, it makes it so much easier then for business to take on the young graduates coming out of those disciplines. So there is a lot of that kind of work happening in South Africa. Whether it is enough and in the right places, I think is a question.
Yep. So thanks for that. And I think that's quite important for me. I think if we could potentially, collaborate as business on that specific initiative, because I think, even within our sector, when we're trying to look at people, a lot of people will come through saying, they want a role in sustainable finance, but they've got no background in sustainable. They've not done any courses, and they're always asking about courses. And I tend to say, well, you've got to go look offshore for those type of courses. I think there's probably significant opportunity as part of this just element and the social element for us to make sure collectively we come up with these type of, education opportunities. All right, moving on to Helen. Now, Helen, I'm going to co-facilitate the co-facilitator. Before I ask you to help with co-facilitation, perhaps it would be useful if you just gave, some kind of the global perspective on what you're seeing, in the just transition. How do we compare? Where we're ranking, what's good, what's bad, and anything along those lines. We tend to obviously look at ourselves and sometimes forget what's happening globally.
Thanks very much, Nigel, and thanks to all. It's been great to hear so far the discussions on what's happening in the different sectors in South Africa and with the business community more broadly. I am not going to do a ranking, but I will say right now, almost every single delegate of different countries I'm talking to here has come up to me and said, what do you know about South Africa? How are they doing this? What's going on? We want to learn. We want to understand. South Africa came forward with a very ambitious new 2030 target, very much focused on people and just transition and equity, and then has had finance coming flowing. Not enough, but a big chunk of finance starting to come from the international side. So everybody's watching South Africa right now and actually wanting to learn from your experience. That being said, there's also a number of other countries that have been moving forward and trying to implement a just transition on the energy side and in some other industries as well, in terms of addressing climate change and doing it in a way where workers are brought along, no one is left behind, and you have equity. And we do see some really exciting examples. We actually have a database at World Resources Institute with others that we maintain called a Just Transition Resource Bank, where we have 35 examples from countries around the world, very potted small examples, and then link into studies and reports on who's doing what and how they're progressing and what sort of successes they're having. So it's really a rich place to look. I want to mention a couple of examples we're seeing. One is here in Scotland. There has been a Just Transition Commission that's been moving forward, and it's really something where the government has taken very seriously the interactive discussions with different parts of society, looking at how to transition in a country, in a nation which is very much reliant on oil and gas revenues and has been, and how to move that forward. So something they're taking very importantly here. Another example, we've seen some really exciting work in Spain. Again, very much building on a just transition dialogue with coal workers, the trade unions, together with the companies, the industry and the electricity companies, and with the local and regional governments, looking together at what might be the solutions forward. And I think these dialogues, which actually bring together the different parts, including the coal miners, including the workers, including the local communities, because it is often a regional and community challenge, not just about the individual workers, but actually for the local community, is really an exciting development and an approach, and has led to some real solutions. Similarly, in Italy, where they've really found Enel, the electricity producer, is shutting down a number of coal plants, but has said they will stay in place and will actually either use those sites to develop renewable energy or do sort of IT development, which can help, and then work with local training centers to train up some of the staff to be able to work there. So starting to look at some of these examples and seeing very much this dialogue, this multi-stakeholder dialogue, really bringing the communities and the workers along on this journey to identify the solutions that could work locally, working with local authorities as well as national, and with, in many cases, the sort of local training colleges to help with the retraining as you identify the solutions has been important. And certainly the financing, which was mentioned by a number of folks on the panel here. So there are examples in other countries, definitely moving ahead, finding these collaborative solutions, and then looking at how to do the transition well. I would pose as the counter example what we've seen in some places and in parts of the US under the previous administration. We were seeing, instead of actually investing in identifying the solutions and the just transition, we were seeing instead sort of subsidies going to try and keep coal continuing in some parts of the US, and they didn't work. The markets had shifted, renewable energy was cheaper, things had moved, so the markets were already shifting and going, but that government funds, which could have been used to really help manage a transition for the communities and workers, instead went into trying to keep the industry going for another year, limping along, and didn't really work in the end. So that's what we want to avoid, is artificially trying to keep something going when it's not going to continue, and instead focus on really managing that transition and getting the finance to support that. So we have definitely seen some examples, and I know one of the areas that was mentioned is also the finance, and you're specializing in that, how to get the finance flowing to help support the just transition. And I would just point out, we actually have in the audience here, Nick Robbins. Can you wave, Nick, for a moment? From LSE, who's doing fantastic work on how do you actually support a just transition through the finance sector. So talk to him afterwards as well.
We can put him on the spot if you want.
Nick, you willing to say anything?
Okay, well, I'm going to bring you under the finance section. So I've got some. Right. So I think we're going to move to some Q&A now. So Helen, feel free to ask our panelists any questions. And I think anybody who's online or in the audience, if anybody has any questions, please let us know. I assume you post them, and then I'll read them out. And then we'll try and we'll obviously ask the panelists, and we'll go through and try and delve into a little bit more detail on certain aspects. So go for it.
So actually, if I could start with one which follows on what I was just saying, and I'd love to ask each of the panelists here, in the work that you're doing, as you're starting to look at a just transition in your sectors, have you been able to engage with the local communities, the workers? Or are you finding through those processes, some of the solutions in terms of the new opportunities are coming through those discussions in a way where you can really move them forward? And I wonder if we could just sort of go along the line here, because I'd love to hear what kind of solutions are coming out of that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important starting block. So I can just reflect on Sasol. We've been working very closely with our communities in Sasolburg and Secunda, where our main operations are. And actually, because Sasol is such a big employer, and in Secunda, basically the only industrial player in the town, the communities and society around the area is so important for us. We've been consistently investing over 500 to 600 million rand per annum in these type of upliftment infrastructure, helping the local municipalities to deliver on water infrastructure, etc. So we've been having a pathway over the last number of years, if not more than a decade, where we realized if we don't care for our community where our workers come from, then we get the outcome of that, which is not good. So we are proactively engaging with the local authorities, the local providers of utilities and services, and through that process gained a lot of insight of how to assist and how to really make it attractive for our people and society in those areas to remain there, to work there, to have a life, to have education, and to look at the whole ecosystem that you require for stability and prosperity. And I think that bodes well for us, because this is what we will build on when we think about the just transition going forward. And may I just add to the education part, we have got around 500 scholarships, bursars in the country at universities, covering from science to accountants to engineering faculties. And we are engaging very proactively with all the universities in South Africa also to enhance the focus on a greener economy that lies ahead of us.
Thanks for that question, Helen. So I think there's a quote from the World Business Council from many years ago that I always like to use, which says, business cannot succeed in a society that fails. And that is so true. You know, you can't just push a bottom line. So what we've done is socioeconomic impact studies in Mpumalanga for plants that we are shutting down. So these are power plants, coal-fired power plants in an area called Imalahleni, Komati, Krotle, Hendrina. And so these are very robust studies that have looked at hard economic modeling. What is the impact on GDP? What is the impact on employment? And we actually now just embarking on 7 more studies for 7 more power plants. And they're very specific to the area. So they're not desktop, they're real studies. But your question was, have we engaged with communities? So as part of the studies, what we did was ensure that we had people that spoke the local languages that went out and did actually house-to-house surveys, but also spoke to big businesses in the area, to what we call the small spaza shops, or the small shops, informal shops, ward councillors, the mayors, the local governments, to understand how they felt about our power plants shutting down. And so there was anxiety around plants shutting down from a perspective of losing jobs, increasing crime, social ills, and all of those kinds of things. But quite surprisingly, and in a nice surprising way, a lot of the communities saw a lot of hope in the repowering and repurposing that we're doing. And their ask was, we see that the shutting down of the coal plant is a good thing for our health. Don't do it overnight. Let us know. So keep us informed all the time. And so running radio programs, media outreach, and that kind of thing. but also please involve us in the repowering and the repurposing. And those were the two big asks. So I think when you engage with communities, a lot of people have a perception that there will be negativity around plant shutdown. And the negativity does come from a fear of job losses, but there's also the opportunities that people see. And so that is what our engagements are telling us. And we will, continue, like Riv says, we will continue also to engage with our communities, because that is actually the lifeblood of the work that we are doing. I just wanted to add one more thing, and that was triggered here about the education. And I think we need to start way before tertiary. We need to start at school. In fact, schools should have a sustainable financing course. I was about to say, should we actually be doing life orientation, but maybe I shouldn't say that. We should be doing, things like sustainable financing, because it's important. And even further back than that, and I just want to say, I read a study recently, that says that men who do household chores raise more ambitious daughters. So I just want to put that out there as well. Let's think about that as well. We don't get rid of stereotypes here.
I do household chores. Look, the mining industry, by its design, in terms of legislation, we do what are called social labor plans, where we have to sit every 5 years with the communities and actually engage between the communities, the local government, and the mining companies in terms of what are the needs of those communities. So there's an intensive engagement, and you've got to put a plan, 5-year plan, and that plan is monitored year by year in terms of delivery, and therefore there is a penalty if you don't actually subscribe to that. So that in itself is what the industry is committed to from a legal point of view. Now, we shouldn't be doing things from a legal point of view. We should be doing things because it's the right thing to do. And therefore, what becomes very important is when you look at these plans, to what extent do these plans have a real impact on the lives of people? Or are we doing these plans as a part of a tick box exercise to confirm or to concur with legislative requirements? So for us, this has been the burning question, is the impact of these social labor plans, because ultimately you want to ensure that at the end of the resource coming to an end, that you will always continue to have thriving economies which are no longer dependent on your existence long after you have gone. Now, this was very much demonstrated to us when we were looking at how do we define impact? How do we know that we are actually having impact? Was to actually go back to mines that we closed 20 years ago, where now mining is no longer happening. Those communities once dependent on the mine, the whole value chain, the supply chain around there was dependent on a mine existing. And what do you see there today? You don't see any of those value chains that once were there. And then that's said to us, there's a fundamental problem with this model. This business model is not sustainable to communities, and therefore we have to rethink about how we engage with communities. So we started there. We started not ones that are operating mines. We went back to those mines, which are 20 years ago we closed, and we sat down with the communities. We said, you used to once use this land before we came. What did you use to do with this land? How were you sustaining yourself with this land? Why is it now that after we've closed the mine and we are actually rehabilitating the land, we are actually, you're not going back to your old ways of doing things? And by and large, we learned very, very interesting observations from listening to the people. First of all, they said, yes, you are closing, you are rehabilitating, you are trying to green the area, but you are greening it with the wrong type of vegetation. Mm-hmm. This type of vegetation is actually taking and sucking water because it's not indigenous vegetation. And therefore, you're actually creating more harm to these communities than what was there before. So we had to then ask to ourselves to say, what then do we talk to them? What do they tell us about what type of vegetation that will be sustainable in that area? But we have to go further than that. was to say, if we are looking at a project, how do we look at it from a full value chain, right to the market? So that when you are designing a project, you are actually looking at how you repurpose that land, you're not just looking at giving them just the tools to be able to work the land, but you are also create the whole value chain of how do you take that, how do you create a manufacturing base out of that, how do you then also take it to market? Because if there's no market, there's not going to be sustainability. So each project then that we are starting to look at, we're saying that if it doesn't have an IRR at the end of the day, a positive IRR, then it's never going to be sustainable, because it's always going to require your existence. So that's how we are thinking now about projects, to say, can we think of projects which I can come to an impact investor and say, you know what, I've got a project here. It's a community-based project driven by the community, skilling the communities, creating new jobs, creating new value chains, creating new markets. Will you be able to fund this? Because I can show you and demonstrate an IRR for you. And that's how we are beginning to think about this project, so that we can make sure ourselves that long after we are gone, those mines, those communities will continue to be sustainable.
And before we get to Joanne, I just want to quickly touch on that. So, I mean, I think that's exactly it. I mean, that's something that I've always played with. There's got to be the IRR of these type of projects makes them viable and makes them essentially last without, you know, I guess handouts and things like that. But for me, the question to you is, if you were looking at a new mine plan, you would design that in the mine plan. So it's part of the closure plan. Can you retrospectively go back and now look at mines that have already closed or been partially closed and kind of vegetate? Because obviously the reason why they vegetated in that manner is because they normally do it for soil stability reasons. So that's normally the reasons they do it. So it's the single soil stability. Can you go back and do that? So in other words, could you revegetate those mines in a way that's going to be useful to the community?
You'll have to do it in two steps.
Yeah.
But they can happen concurrently. Not all land gets used for mining. There are some areas that you don't mine, okay? But those areas have been neglected, all right? So what you need to do is to now start saying that I'm going to start creating new economies on that land that I've not actually done it, but I'm going to do it in a regenerative way. While I start now looking at how I can take out the alien species in this other area, which I've actually put in there for years, and actually now start repurposing that land. So you almost have to do two at the same time, so that you can also create a community that is going to be excited about actually working on their own land, as we are busy also looking at resuscitating the existing ones that we've actually closed over the years. So that is how you've got to look at it, much more holistically. And what you will find that within an area, there are multiple type of sectors of economic activity that you can create, right from agri, but also from manufacturing, and there's also transport. So it's the whole ecosystem just comes alive.
Perfect. Joanne?
Okay, so I think that maybe where South African businesses had the edge, and this is looking at it internationally. So, for example, we're the regional partner of the World Business Council on sustainable development, and over years seeing the conversations in the WBCSD, what I think has become very striking is that the kind of social license to operate that we've been talking about in relation to the social and labor plans and other elements in our legislative framework, so the requirement for business to invest in enterprise development, the requirement for business to invest in skills development, has created, I suppose, a community of practice on the one hand, but a set of experiments in relation to how business invests in society that has yielded a whole lot of lessons. Some of those lessons have been good, some have been bad, some have worked, some have failed. But there is a bedrock, I think, now of experience across business in relation to how you engage and invest in society that can very easily and productively be taken into this context of the energy transition and into the context of the just transition. I think that the one thing that many companies are going to need to do, building on the kind of experiences that we've heard from Eskom, Sasol, and Exaro, is really the process through which one engages with community and the depth of the conversation and the willingness to take the time to have those conversations is really a determinant of success. We've seen it in any kind of rural development initiative. We've seen it in urban contexts. And I think that there is probably across a much wider range of sectors, a whole set of learnings and experience that we would want to take into the broader business community around that. So I think we have a very good and solid basis. I think there's obviously always that we can do more. I think that Xolisi's point around impact investment is a really, really important one, because I think it's also about not getting business to support the process, but then business goes out of the equation and you have community-owned infrastructure and initiatives. And I think that's the other thing where probably quite a lot of work is needed, because that's ultimately what we want. I think that there is a vast amount of desperation in South Africa in these communities. And I think that if we do this work, if we take the time to get the foundations right, and to be able to identify the right initiatives with the right degree of participation, we can probably do some really great things. Thanks. And apologies, I am going to have to leave in a few minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon.
And I think a very important thing here is that, last week, I have a conversation with Andre about what they are doing and what we are doing. And I said, goodness me, if I can take some of that, what you are doing there, I can include it to what I'm doing here, the multiplier effect, and he's saying the same thing. And so therefore the collaboration in this instance becomes the key, because that's where you're going to get really impact. It's when things, different ideas around, because we're all aiming for the same outcome, isn't it? We all want to create impact, but each of us are looking at this thing with a different lens and with a different nuance. And when you start adding these things together, you start seeing them in. The things that can be done are just unbelievable. And so this collaboration becomes extremely important.
I think I just like to add to what Xolisi is emphasizing there. So keep in mind that South Africa is a mining industry par excellence. So there are many different types of mining activities. So the future mine and the future minerals that we need in the decarbonization trajectory is going to be also still there and growing. So don't forget, we've got a just transition that also moving some coal miners to other mining activities. And what the point that Xolisi made there, the collaboration with other mining houses now in the precious metals area. So you can also not only reskill your miners, but you can also bring them to bear in other mining activities, which few other countries also have that ability to just transition in that aspect.
I think on the collaboration, that was actually my next point, because for me, that's key to our success, to be honest. And I've seen us in the past where specifically the mining industry has often not collaborated, especially where they're competing, there's land in between, and one's making water, one needs water, and one won't provide to the other. And I've been there, I've seen that, and I could never understand. Now I think there's an ability for us to create that circular economy. One provides something to the other, and I think that's a great example. One thing I wanted to catch on was the Energy Council. I can't remember who raised the Energy Council, but do we have the right representation on the Energy Council? Is it cross-cutting enough, or do you need, for example, financiers as well on that to provide? Because I guess where I'm coming from is it's all very well, you coming up with an idea saying this is what we think would work, and then you come to the banks and the banks are like, oh, well, we should have actually structured it slightly differently. But just happy to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Nigel, spot on. When we launched the council, we said we had to bring a couple of players to create momentum and to get the Department of Minerals and Energy really to support the concept of the Energy Council. Our biggest focus now in the next months would be to get a much more inclusive representation of the areas that's not there. So it will go from renewables, it will be the major energy consumers, it will be the financing part of it. So this is not about the producers of energy. This is about, the Energy Council is about the ecosystem of energy in South Africa. And I think that's what the long-term vision is that we bring all of those players together, but we create, like the Minerals Council did very well, that we bring impact on the interface with the regulator and policy. So that's where we think the biggest unleashing of positive momentum and impact will be. So yes, finance would be welcome to participate in the Energy Council.
Do you have any questions, Helen?
I think we're actually reaching the end here, probably.
Half an hour more.
We've got half an hour more.
We do have half an hour more.
Fantastic. Good.
Otherwise,
good.
we can get Nick to come up and give us a guest 2 minutes on your view.
I think that'd be wonderful to hear a little bit.
Oh, you have to come up. I'm afraid we don't have a roving mic. We're going to put you on the spot. I know it's unorthodox, but. Better grab the else. I'll step out. Well, there you go.
Well, thank you very much, Nick Robbins from the London School of Economics. We've been doing work for the last 3-4 years, particularly with the investor community, about net zero and just transition. This has been gaining increasing traction. And I think particularly it'd be really good to hear from the panel is the dialogue they're having with their investors. So we've heard already here in COP, we have the Global Finance Alliance for Net Zero, 130 trillion. Banks, investors. Just transition is inside that. We also have investor engagement through the Climate Action 100+ initiative, stewardship, shareholder engagement. Sasol and Eskom are part of that. Just transition is being part of them. I'm sure Exaro investors as well. So it'd be very interesting to hear, perhaps in sort of 3 dimensions. One, in terms of shareholders, the debate now in terms of how they are engaging with you, not just on the net zero goal, but on just transition, so they can have long-term returns. And then starting to think about those other asset classes, infrastructure, private equity, the debt markets. We've talked about green bonds, transition bonds. And then I think you were talking, sir, about impact investing. So there is through the UK's G7 task, there's an impact task force to really think about sort of just transition financing mechanisms for the impact investing community who want returns, but also want to generate intentional social and environmental impact. So I would be very interested just to hear about the dialogue you're having with your investors who want to now see through to the communities you're serving and dealing with on the just transition. Thank you. Thanks.
And who would like to start with answering that, Fleetwood?
I think the important part for the investor is basically to understand how would you affect the just transition and still remain profitable for us as a shareholder investing in you. And I think the starting point is to have a credible plan to demonstrate that you can achieve this, remain profitable, and still, decarbonize your assets. And that's the first starting block, of course. And then they are also looking from their own. So the portfolio investors, the institutional investors, look at their total portfolio in terms of how your carbon footprint stack up in that investment regime. And I think there's also propensity to encourage all the players to reduce and have plans. So I think the engagements we had, we've got a plan. We welcome that you engage with us further. We see that you would remain still profitable, so you're investable, but we need to see execution of this plan now. So the communication of how you deliver on a decarbonization plan, including the just transition, is really where the shareholder or the investor will say, now I believe you're on the right track. Talking about it only is not going to get them over the line. It's about demonstrating, practically delivering that what you said you envisage.
Thanks. So I think if I could just add, it's similar to what Fleetwood was saying. When we do due diligence with our investors now, previously maybe many years ago it was only about balance sheets, and I think, and I'll come to the ESCOM paradigm, because I know as a publicly owned company, as a state-owned company that's usually indebted, there is a slightly different dimension to it as well. But nobody for now, when you look at due diligence, it's along that full suite of ESG, but also transition plans. So even if somebody is investing in a transmission line, they want to know what your plans are to reduce emissions on your generation side of electricity generation. So I think all along that value chain of investment, investors are also asking these questions around ESG commitments and transition commitments. And like Fleetwood says, they don't want to just see lovely plans. They want to know what your timelines are, what your implementation plans are. But I must just say that ESCOM's net zero by 2050 goal, it is not a full stop after that. We do say with an increase in sustainable jobs, because from a South African perspective, when you look at the just transition, the just and the transition are just as important. You can't just talk about decarbonization goals without talking about the increase in the social impact. And what I find very encouraging is even in the 8.5 billion deal that we did and the discussions with investors, there's a huge emphasis on what are you doing around the just? What are you doing with communities and with the social impacts of your transition? So for me, that is very encouraging. ESCOM is publicly owned, is a state-owned company, as South Africans would know, and is usually in debt. But what I must say is, there is a debt strategy that government is working with together with ESCOM in terms of, and we're not going to get into that now, but there's a whole strategy on how to deal with the debt. But what we're finding in discussions with investors as well is that there's no appetite to fund legacy coal debt. There's no appetite to fund the continuation of coal. So even if you look at improvements on your current plant to deal with things like air quality emissions, it's very hard to find funding to do that because investors are concerned about perpetuating coal. So if you're improving your coal plant, you can perpetuate coal. So I think that's something that we have put very much into our value proposition as South Africa from a just transition perspective in what is our way forward. And I think Fleetwood made a very good point around the mining industry and the value we have in the mining industry is not just from coal mining. And I think from the Minerals Council, from the likes of Exaro, they've looked at how do you use the skills we have, what we've developed in the mining industry over the years in new mining industries. And that is something we shouldn't lose. So I think in our plans around transition, we must be very clear and frank to investors about what businesses we will continue in South Africa. We're not going to suddenly become producers of PV panels only. We will continue with mining activities, for example. But how do we do that in a way that is sustainable is what investors want to see, and that is what we need to communicate in our plans.
Thank you. What we have learned along the way is that for many years now, we have had to try and help educate our local investors about what are the big shifts that are happening globally that are shaping the world. Many years ago, when we really embarked on this ESG journey, many years ago, a lot of our investors couldn't quite understand what this actually means. The first thing, what's the capital allocation going to look like? How much is it going to cost us? Before they could actually start understanding, because now they were fund managers who had pension funds allocated to them, started putting pressure on them to say, hey guys, this thing is important to us. So therefore now the conversation started shifting. Same with climate, issues of climate. Again, when you start talking about how you have to deal with climate abatement and all of that, initial conversations are around it's always around the capital allocation issue. So one thing what one is realizing is that you have to do what you need to do with your business in a way that you actually help them understand that these things don't mean that there's less There's no dividend that's going to come to you. But in actual fact, you help them understand that you are actually trying to de-risk the business so that dividends can continue to come. Another critical area that we had to deal with was the insurance companies, because we've got to insure these assets. And we are finding it much more difficult being a primarily coal-based company to get insurance cover, and to the extent that we have to do self-insurance now in a way that we have to put more capital in terms of creating our own insurance captive. So we're having these issues on both sides. But we are at, I think, at a stage now, at a very inflection point, whereby I think the whole global drive around issues of climate, around issues of decarbonization, are at such an inflection point that I don't think any company or any industry is absolved from actually having to deal with this. Your banking sector, you are being under the same challenges yourselves about your own shareholders putting pressure on you where you can put your money in. So I think now the world, I think, is waking. All industries are awakening. And I think we're going to start having different conversations with our shareholders to say, what are you doing to protect our investment now around issues of climate change? How quickly are you going to get there? Because the risk now has become so evidently clear to everybody. The fact that we are here, we're talking about this 8.5 billion. Of course, it talks to a different conversation we're going to start having to have with our own shareholders about what this means for the country and what it's going to mean for our businesses and other industries. So I think this conversation is always a shifting conversation. It also happens at the board level. You know, you always have to be taking your board on this new discovery, new journey. We're not even sure how we're going to even define how we're going to actually implement this 8.5. So there's going to be questions around that. What does that mean? What are the risks? How are we going to monitor this thing? So it's going to be an interesting journey for all of us going ahead. And it's going to be an interesting conversation for all of us. But one thing that is good is that all of us are in the same boat together this time. And I think we're all beginning to row in the same direction.
Thanks very much. And I think wonderful examples of how this journey, we're moving on this journey. And sometimes it's actually outpacing what some of the companies are doing with the insurance sector, with the finance sector, starting to shift. And then how you actually make sure that you can do the transition well in your companies and for people. So thank you very much for those examples. I do want to follow up on a question. It links back to something I think Mandy said earlier, and Joanne, who's left us, also said, as we're going through this journey and starting to chart out what does it look like for South Africa to go net zero by 2050, using modeling tools, analysis, deep, rigorous assessments of what's happening in the sector. But often when you bring these sort of dramatic changes through an economic analysis, you don't get the buy-in necessarily of people to what's there. And what you see is where you need to transition out of, and that you will have growth industries, but it's not always obvious which are those growth industries, which are the ones that's, you know, South Africa will not be just photovoltaics. What else will it be, etc. And I'd love to hear from you a bit, Mandy, how the engagement around some of that rigorous economic analysis, has that been well received as you've been going through the discussions in ESCOM with the community, with the workers? Have people understood it? Have they recognized the benefits and the opportunities really for South Africa that would be reflected in that modeling, the economic, the social benefits, but also to hear from both Fleetwood and Kalise, you know, to what extent you're seeing this identification of the opportunities that are different. You mentioned already, Fleetwood, that in some cases there's going to be different types of mining. There might be mining industries that are going to grow in South Africa because we need some of those minerals for the new world. But Kalise, it would be great to hear a little bit more on where you're seeing the new growth industries from your side. But Mandy, if I could start with you.
Sure, thanks, Helen. I think it's a great question, and it's a difficult question because, you know, models are only as good as the data you put in it, right? You put garbage in, you get garbage out. And what we've been finding is that when we talk to local communities, and so we've done a lot of economic modeling based on data in the community. So our power plants are in areas called Dipalaseng and Steve Tshwete municipalities. So we've used data related to those municipalities in terms of our economic modeling. And we've done models looking at what is the impact on the GDP from shutting down the coal plants, but also along the value chain. So what is the value on, what is the impact on direct jobs, indirect jobs, and induced jobs? And so we have those numbers for that local area, for the broader region called Mpumalanga, and then for South Africa. And so everyone sits back and says, okay, that's great, you have the numbers, so what? And it's what you do with those numbers that is so important. And so we've looked at what are the mitigation strategies around that. So when we talk about the impact on jobs in Dipalaseng or Steve Chwete, we're also looking at what jobs or what projects or repurposing activities can we engage in that area that's going to create jobs. So in terms of, so that is what we're dealing with in terms of the mitigation strategies from the numbers that the models are giving us. In terms of how it's received, so the biggest criticism we hear, and we hear this from a number of studies that are being done in the country, is, are you using multipliers from South Africa? Are you using American multipliers, European multipliers? Because then that makes zero sense. So I think one of our lack in the country, and people can correct me in the audience if I'm wrong, is that we don't have enough South African data, South African multipliers around things like job creation, in especially new industries, which, granted, we don't have that many new industries in the last few years. We have the renewable industry, we have the renewable IPP program, which gave us some of those numbers. But I think what we need to coalesce around is the multipliers we use and the background data we use in terms of our modeling. So that was the one criticism. And I think to a large extent, the work done by the NBI using BCG and some of the modeling work we've done, we've been able to find South African factors. The second criticism is around where you create the jobs. So if you are losing jobs in eMalahleni, but you're creating jobs in Gauteng, people don't necessarily value that. If you look at, so one of the other stats we have is the age distribution of our working force. In an ESCOM environment, the average age of people that would be impacted by the shutdown of plants is between 35 and 49, which is the working population. So if you look at the transition in the UK, north of England, if you look at the transition in Germany, a lot of their guys were closer to retirement than our guys are. So you still have to make sure that you're employing those guys. A lot of them, the younger people in particular, are willing to move. So if there's a job opportunity in the Joburg area, they're willing to move, or Cape Town or Natal, KZN. But a lot of people want to stay where they are. You assume that if you live in a mining town, you actually want to move. But a lot of people want to stay where they are. So they're saying, if we can talk about the greater than 300,000 net jobs we would create from transitioning to renewables, but they're not all in that local area. So that's the other criticism. But I also think we must be realistic. We know that we can't come at this with rose-colored glasses. We know that we're not going to create all the jobs in the local area. And so you have to have those difficult conversations about, is your staff willing to move? Are you willing to create, willing to relocate for jobs? So I think the data is very useful, but that's the resistance we're getting to some of it. But we need to have honest conversations around how we use that as well.
Thank you, Lucy. So the way that that I would look at it is that we have two imperatives. The one is sustain jobs, preserve jobs, and the new decarbonized economy. Where can we sustain jobs? So that is in all industries where we have reinvented them to a sustainable feedstock or a sustainable product based on renewables. So let me take a couple of examples. If we can get a hydrogen economy in South Africa that can enable our steel industry to go green, that enables our automotive industry in South Africa to use green steel. Our automotive industry can reuse renewable, and that sustain so many jobs in the automotive export industry. We have the steel manufacturing industry. So we should not forget that renewable pathway to go, solar, wind, and hydrogen is about, the majority of the industrialized jobs are sustained. Then on top of it, it is about how do we mitigate the jobs at risk in the coal mining arena, and how do we create the new jobs in the new economy of a hydrogen economy and the renewable economy. And I think the work that we've done is that the new opportunities far outpaces the losses that we will see in the areas of coal. But it is about what Mandy has indicated here, is about those two does not necessarily gel in the same geography, in the same skill sets. And that is our challenge, is how to bridge that in a period that, you know, affords you enough traction to do it effectively. So it remains a challenge, but I do think we should not forget the sustainability of jobs that we preserve by going through a renewable and a green economy. That's for me, that's where the majority of jobs will be sustained.
Thanks, very good. We took a decision that because we have skills in mining, we have been in base metals, in mineral sands. So we've not only been in coal, we've been in iron ore. So we've got these mining skills to start looking in a different direction. And by and large, that's exactly what we've done. We have made a decision. We came out with that, communicated in our Capital Markets Day not long ago, that we are going to be now moving into the metals that are going to support a new green economy. And you can just imagine how many of those that there are, but we've chosen 3 of those to say we're going to start focusing on that. And by and large, part of those metals, one of them is very, very much South Africa is endowed with. So, that's where we're going to be going. But we've also said we want to take our renewable business now to become a global business, in the sense that in the next coming 7 to 10 years, we want to move from 231 megawatts to 3 gigs. And hopefully we can even do better than that. So already now our focus is on that, on driving that strategy, so that we can also, in the meantime, be actually transitioning ourselves from a coal-based revenue earning business to one that can be substantially earning from renewables and other minerals. So we have a plan around doing exactly that. But also, I think what is also, I think we need to think about, even in our areas where we've got coal mines in the Mpumalanga, we don't know when that day is going to come. Okay, nobody knows it. But we're all talking about we need to transition from it. Is to say, how do we create new jobs around there? And this is where, for us, the whole land use becomes an opportunity to create new economies that didn't exist, whereby now, as you take a person who was having a coal mining job and does not necessarily want to go and work at the Northern Cape, we've created a whole new vibrant economy where the SMMEs now are being really nurtured in terms of creating new sustainable jobs as part of this transition. That then it actually creates those opportunities whereby the people in themselves don't see the closure of the mines as being a threat, but they see how the mine itself, while it's there, while it's transitioning, it's creating new opportunities. And I want to give you an example of a mine that was once closed. I won't say for what reason, but that mine was closed and we had to retrench 1,300 people as a result of that decision. It was not our decision, but it was done. Today, because we thought differently about the workforce of what opportunities can be created, that mine now is owned 50% by the workers that were once retrenched, you see. So you can always find opportunities to create new opportunities for your workers. And if we can do this whole land repurposing, whereby you can create new job opportunities, new industries, economic industries around where the mines are today, it becomes easier as you are displacing people from one job to see that there's an opportunity that I can be an entrepreneur, I can have this opportunity to do something different.
Hold on to the mic. I think one last quick question for each of you before we close. And it's obviously being a banker, you know, we're walking this journey with you as well. I mean, you're our clients, and we obviously want you to be our clients in the future. What do you want from the financial sector? I mean, what would you like to see more of? What you see like less of? How can we support you in this journey, each of you, as you walk the path?
I think from where I sit is that a new model has to come about from the financial sector. It can't be the same. Okay, so you yourselves have to start reinventing yourselves to say, how do we become relevant in being able to actually support this journey forward? Because by and large, the requirements are going to require you to not only just look at pure commercial aspects, but it's probably a blended aspect of how you look at this, because the opportunities for the commercial parts become very much more bigger once you can become almost becoming a catalyst in the earlier phases. I know that's normally your development financing, but I think there's a whole reimagining that's required from your side.
Perfect. Andy?
Well, I have a tagline attributed to me this COP, and that is "Show me the money." So, show me the money. But I 100% agree with what Nkulisi is saying. I think what we're finding, the frustration in our discussions with investors, is this line: "Oh, we haven't done that before, so we're not sure whether we're going to be able to get this done in the future." So it's around innovation in thinking, which is why I was saying earlier, the innovation should not just come from industry. The innovation needs to come from all of the sectors. When we've, and Nkulisi just reminded me of something, when we first started doing adaptation studies at ESCOM many years ago on how to deal with climate risk, we could not find one insurer or reinsurer that had done work around adaptation, climate adaptation, and the costing of climate adaptation. So I know it's slightly off topic, but just the point is that I don't think the finance industry is moving as quickly as the rest, and Helen made this point, as the rest of industry in terms of transition. So I think it's innovation around thinking. It does not mean that if you haven't done something before, it can't be done in future.
Nigel, I think it's all about the view that the banking industry has on the bankability of projects. And with that is the risk aspects that is considered, and with that is the premium on finance that you get. And that's where we need to recalibrate. Because the renewable space is a different industry. It is going to be an industry that is typical utility type in investments, maybe lower margins, but very, very constant. There's no cyclicality. The cost of sun doesn't go like oil price up and down. The cost of sun is free. It is about the financing, it's about the maintenance that you will get your return on a very rateable, steady, low risk weight. And I think that's the aspect where we need to take hands and say, okay, how do we think afresh with a bankable project with a risk being much lower than any other industrial type of project where you put capital in? And how do we get the most competitive financing? Because the opportunity is trillions of rands in the South African economy. It is not, a couple of billion, it is really trillions. And if you think about a lower margin, a lower risk bankable project, but at scale and at numbers, then the banking industry see their part in the sun as well. And you will enjoy, as part of the whole industry, your benefits through that, realization. So just a couple of thoughts.
Thanks. Helen, I don't know if you have any final words from yourself before we thank our panelists.
Absolutely one. And I'm actually going to sort of respond to your question as well on something we're seeing in a number of countries. One of the things that's been discussed this last week is also the public development banks, right? The multilateral development banks, regional development banks, African development bank, national development banks, and how difficult they found it to really make investments which will help to leverage private finance. So we are seeing challenges where the private banks have not used certain tools before, they're facing new industries, and then instead of actually seizing those and moving forward, they're worried about the risks and not able to move forward. So how can you, from the private sector side, actually engage also with some of these development banks and find ways where they can help to buy down the risk, which attracts the private finance. And so altogether, we're able to move this much, much more rapidly together, using that scarce public funds really smartly to actually complement what the private investors can do. So I think that's one where I think we need to see a lot more action collaboratively together to help the industries do this transition. So thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks for co-facilitating. And thanks, Polisi, Mandy, and Fleetwood for being willing panelists. And let's make this happen. Thanks very much.